Okay, we've got our two deck halves glued together. Things are pretty dry. We still have a little cleanup to do with sanding and that. But in the meantime, we've got it set on the hull of the board. Now we're going to mark around the perimeter so that we can make some rough cuts to get the deck roughly cut to size. We'll do that before we glass the underside and join the two halves so that we don't have a lot of extra wood to work with and make it a little bit more manageable. So we simply have this laying on the board. We've centered it. We've made sure that our 8-foot pieces on the perimeter are right out to the edge of the board, enough so that when we do our round over, we will make sure that we don't have any little gaps or missing spots. So we want to center that pretty carefully, and feels like we're pretty good. I have clamps on this to keep the center pieces firmly together, and we're pretty much ready to go. So with that, we're going to start our pencil line. They're on the widest parts of the board. We're actually just barely wide enough. In fact, maybe even a little shy, but it won't matter because when we do our round over, that part will be taken care of. So there's the easy half. The other half, have to climb around behind this thing. And right over the top of my heater here, which is, by the way, quite hot. But the nights have been in the 30s, and in fact, a lot of the nights have been in the 20s. So I've had to keep the heaters going pretty much continuously. So with that, we'll mark the other side. We'll end up turning these pieces over, cutting a rough fit. Then we'll go back and we'll glass and join the halves together, and then it'll be pretty much ready to mount, with the exception of the board's also going to have one more modification, which is a fin box, and that'll be another segment that we'll do on adding that to the board. Okay, so we're moving along with our strip deck. We had the two halves each assembled. At this point, you can see that we have one half still in its, you might say, full state, uncut. The other half I've now rough cut to the board, and when I rough cut, I cut it fairly close because ultimately we're going to router a 45-degree edge, which is ultimately going to be rounded over to probably a good radius over. So if you aren't perfect, it actually won't matter. None of it will show later. So we've got one half cut. We're going to move it off the hull of the board, and I'm going to set up the other half with some clamps to hold it in place. I'm going to use a saber saw to cut this, but of course you can use any number of hand saws and things like that. But we're going to start out, like I say, with the saber saw. I'm going to clamp this to a couple of spots on the framework of the board, so that, let's see, there we go, so that it's going to hold it in place. When I do a plywood deck and I'm doing a whole deck at one time, I actually just scoot it off one side to the other. But because we're doing this half at a time, it needs some stabilization. So with the stabilization, it's going to be clamps, and we'll clamp right to the bulkhead. And we'll put one somewhere to the front, maybe a little close to the front even. And then we'll put another one towards the rear of the board. Looks like I just lost a pad off my clamp. And that'll give us adequate stabilizing for the saw work. And of course we've got to make sure our line is well off the edge of the board when we do this. And you can make errors and actually cut into the side of your board. Having built a number of these boards, I know this from experience. So experience pays off here, and hopefully we're not going to do that anymore. Luckily, it wasn't a bad thing. Or not a bad one anyway, just a mildly bad one. Okay, so we've got it clamped in place. Going to find a starting point, probably up at the nose here. I'm actually cutting it a little extra wide at the nose so that I can make sure that when I join the two halves that I can pull those together, so I'm leaving a little appendage on there. So I'm not quite cutting that line. So, Now you'll note two things. One, be careful you don't hang your cord up on the edge. Initially it'll start there, but then pull it off to the side. The other thing, you can see that I'm actually way out on the edge here where it's safe, holding this a little bit just to help stabilize it a little bit more. It's really not going to go anywhere, but it is fairly light and moves around a bit. Probably cut it off and done. So, got both halves rough cut. I'm going to pull those clamps off. And of course we've got some overhang in the back, so after we get this all together, we've got a perfect tail block here, which lo and behold is going to match the board and make a pretty nice setup, I think. So the tail block's going to continue right off the end here, and we're going to have a way cool setup. So the deck's not on, but there are the two halves sitting in place to give you just a general idea of what this thing is going to look like when it's done. Of course, we've got some sanding to do. We've got a lot of edge work. The rails will be rounded well over, and it'll look a whole lot better when all that part of it's done. But nevertheless, we're on our way. Got a good start. Got a little bit of bow in this one. I guess it's been sitting out here in the cool, damp weather. But when we mount the deck, we'll make sure that doesn't exist anymore. And I've left this little appendage at the nose. We have a little tiny gap between the two center pieces, so we're going to pull those together with a clamp when we glue this. We'll be good to go. So we've set this on here now. Right, it's actually upside down. We have what was when we glued the strips together. What's up now is the bottom. Therefore, there's glue residue. One of them, I learned this after the first one. The first one, I left all the glue as it was. The second one, before the glue was too hard, I actually turned it over, used a scraper, and took off a lot of it. So I've got a big head start on one half, and I'm going to very carefully, without doing any divots or dips with the random orbit sander, see if we can sand off the rest of the residue. Okay, here we go with the next step of our cedar strip deck. We've got both sides of the deck, all the excess glue sanded off of the underside. We have it on the work top, basically upside down. I'm going to be mixing up a thick glue, almost a fillet material really, so it matches the red cedar better. I'll be putting that down the center to join the two halves. I will probably also end up, to make sure that's pushed snugly together, I left a little appendage up at the front of the board where I can put a clamp so that there's no gap or no tendency to spread. And then in other areas of the board I can put nails through to put some pressure, and then after I have the center strip glued, I will roll the glass cloth over in position. I will apply resin, squeegee the cloth out fairly dry. I'm using 6 ounce under the deck for extra strength, and then we will put some probably wax paper and boards across the top and place some weights on it so there's no tendency to curl or any such thing like that. So we're going to go on with the next step here, and we'll get back on film here in a few minutes. Okay, so what we've done is with a helper, we have put half of the deck on edge. I used a combination of wood flour and cellufill, mostly wood flour, to get just about the right wood tone for the center joint, and I made it a pretty stiff mix. Not quite a fillet stiffness, but very, very close. So we're going to now lay this down, push it against the other half, use some well-placed nails and maybe a clamp here or there to keep it snug. Then we'll roll out the glass cloth and start squeegeeing. So the next step is coming shortly. Okay, the next step is accomplished. We've taken our two deck halves. We had already, of course, put the fillet-like glue between the two center strips, which, as you probably recall from earlier in the process, the cove side was removed on both, so their flat sides butted together, so that the outside, each side of the outside of the board is the bead side, and that way, of course, we have symmetry. So we've joined these together The hull, or the deck bottom, I'm sorry, has been coated with a layer of 6-ounce cloth. We're going just a little heavier than we do on the plywood boards because we want to make sure that we have plenty of strength, as the strips aren't necessarily inherently as strong as plywood. We'll use 4-ounce on the top when we glass the outside of the board. Now, there was a little bit of a tendency for the deck to want to curl a little bit, and because we have a seam in the middle that we want to keep real even, you can see that I've spaced out pieces of wood with weights and wax paper underneath all along the length of the board. This is keeping it nice and flat. At the nose of the board, because the strips wanted to move apart just slightly, we've actually put a clamp on there. When I rough cut it, I left a little bit of extra strip right in the center just for that purpose, so that can be clamped tight together. So we have right now is a glassed underside of the deck. So basically the deck is finished to the point of being ready to mount onto the hull of the board, and at that point it'll be just like this. It'll be the same process as putting on a plywood deck. We do have some scrap material left from this deck, and we're going to take that scrap material and we're actually going to make a tail block overlay. The board is upside down right now, the hull, so you can't really see where it's going to go, but those strips will align with the strips on the deck, so it's a continuum from nose to the bottom of the tail block. In the meantime, we've begun another process, because in addition, this board is going to have a fin box mounted in it. So we've marked a fin box. The fin box is a 10.5-inch box. It will start 10 inches up from the tail. It will actually cut through the bulkhead on the top, and toward that end, we've already cut a section of bulkhead out, and we'll be mounting a balsa block that will be channeled out for the fin box to set in. And as we go on, we'll have more footage on that. So for now, that's where we're at. Again, the deck is basically finished to the point of being able to mount on the board, and then finished as if it were a plywood deck or any other kind of deck.